Hello everybody, and welcome to the third and final video on the introduction to loops. In this video I will introduce you to other kinds of loops called do while and for loops for a total of three kinds of loops now. We've been dealing with while for two videos, and today we'll do for and do while. So the three kinds of loops all do basically the same thing. They let you repeat a chunk of code over and over again until something becomes false. But they're used for slightly different reasons, even though their structure is basically the same. Now, in particular here, while and do while are almost essentially the same. So most of this video will focus on for loops, because once you understand while, do while is almost immediate. So speaking of do while, here's what the syntax looks like. You say do something as long as some statement is true. And so unlike any other if or loop kind of setup here, you actually do need a semicolon after this. I'm not sure why. Okay, it's just the way they built it. But you're just saying, hey, do this stuff as long as this statement here is true. The only difference between a while and a do while in terms of what they do is that a do while loop will always run at least once. Okay? So the reason is that the statement, the actual Boolean statement that you check to see if you want the code to keep running, if you want the loop to loop back, that statement comes at the end. So in terms of what the computer does, it reads from top to bottom. So first it sees this code, and then it says, oh, well, as long as this statement is true, I should repeat this. So really the only structural difference between the while and the do while is that do while runs at least once. A while loop may never run. It depends on if that statement is true or not once you get there. Okay, so and the syntax, of course, is different, but in terms of what they do, they're essentially the same. So a do while loop is really just a while loop that is guaranteed to run once. While loops are not guaranteed to run. So why might you use this? Well, here's an example. Imagine a program that plays Hangman for you. Using a while loop, if you want the game to loop over and over again, you would have to say, okay, their response is yes. As long as their response is yes, do the code. And then you could ask them, do you want to play again? And then if they say yes, you loop back, right? Using a do while loop, it actually doesn't matter what the value of response is at the beginning. Since they opened your program, presumably you want, like it wants to play Hangman, right? They want to play Hangman at least once. So you can say, well, do the Hangman stuff, and then at the end, ask again, get that from them, and then the computer checks if this is true or not. So let me just show you this in the compiler. This is a really stupid little program. It just says hi to you, and it will keep doing it as long as you tell it to. Okay, so response is initialized to yes. Okay. So I go inside the loop and I say hi. And then it says again, and I'll say, well, sure, I like being said hi to. Again, sure, and then I'll quit. So suppose I change that Y to no, or I just didn't even initialize it, and instead I used a do while loop. That means I would put the while statement down here, semicolon, and then say do. Okay, now you might think this loop doesn't even run because N is not the same thing as Y. So initially the statement is false, but with a do while loop, you'll run that code at least once, and then it will update at the end. So it ran that hi, right? And I'll say, yeah, sure, and then no, and it quits. Okay, so do while really, it's not anything different really from a while. The structure is exactly the same. The only difference is the Boolean condition that it checks comes at the end, and the loop will run once, maybe more. While loops don't have to run at all. Just to emphasize that, let me pull this back up here. So with response being equal to no, well, now the first thing we do is check if that condition is true. And in this case, it's false. So when I run the program, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't show me anything. That's because it skipped over this loop and then stopped. Okay, so that's how a do while works. You don't necessarily ever have to use it. It makes some sort of like a rational sense here. If you know you have code you want to run at least once and then loop back, you might use a do while rather than a while. This code here is more natural looking than this. Okay, so now let's spend the bulk of our time on for loops. For loops are also loops. Okay, so they will loop the same code. They'll just do the same code over and over again until something stops it. But the syntax is quite a bit different. The way it works is you say the word for, and then you initialize some new variable that only exists for that for loop. So you're going to create a variable for this loop. Once this loop is done, that variable is destroyed in memory. Okay, that box is put away. Then, just like with a while loop, you have to give it some Boolean statement to check so that it can see if it breaks out of the loop. So you might say, you know, response equals yes or something, I don't know, but something that will break the loop once a condition is met. And then you have something called an update condition, which is just some way of changing the value of this variable you initialized here. And then you have your code that is going to loop. Okay, so this right now is totally mysterious, okay? In particular, the first thing here and the last thing here make no sense, okay? Let me just give you some examples to show you how this works. For, I'm going to initialize a variable. So for int I equals 0. And then this next statement is a Boolean statement, and also confusing. You separate with semicolons, right? Semicolon, semicolon. Anyway, this middle statement is a Boolean statement, and that's the as long as. As long as I is less than or equal to 5, do this code. So the loop will keep running as long as this condition is met. So since I starts at 0, this condition is met initially, so you're going to run this code at least once. This condition here tells you how to update the value of I after each pass through the loop. So the way this particular for loop works is you create a variable called I and set it equal to 0. This variable I only exists for this loop. So when the loop is done, I goes away. As long as I is 5 or less, this loop will keep running. After each pass through the loop, the value of I becomes 1 bigger. So I is 0. That's less than or equal to 5. I'll run the loop. When I get to the end of the loop, it will up the value of I to 1. 1 is still less than or equal to 5, so I will run the loop again and then up the value of I again to 2, etc. So this loop will run 6 times for I equals 0, I equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it will stop. So let me just put that over here. So for int I equal to 0, as long as I is less than or equal to 5, up the value of I by 1 every time, and tell me hi, please. If I run this, what should happen is that loop should run 6 times, and it should tell me hi each time, and I didn't tell it to put a space in, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 highs is what happened here. So that's how a for loop works, okay? It takes getting used to, you know. This is not natural at first unless you have had MATLAB or something, but if you've never seen this before, this is kind of mysterious. It's not even clear why you need this, but let me just give you some more examples. This update condition here, you can update I however you want. So you can up the value by 2 after each pass through the loop if you want to. So what happens in this loop is I is 1. 1 is less than or equal to 5. So I run this code. But then, since I is I plus 2, you're going to take that value of 1 and add 2 to it so that I becomes 3. 3 is less than or equal to 5, so you run the code. Then I becomes 5. And 5 is less than or equal to 5, so you'll run the code one more time and then you'll stop after that, because then the value of I gets too big. So what happens here is I should get high 3 times. 1 for, oops, sorry. A 1 there. I should get I 3 times. Once for I equals 1, then for I equals 3, then for I equals 5, and then I'm done. Okay. So let me just show you some more examples. Let's just march through these relatively quickly here. What does this for loop do? It starts at 1. the value of I goes up by 1 every time. And as long as I is less than or equal to 99, I print the value of I. So what this loop will do is it will print 1, then print 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 99, and then it will stop, and there will be a new line in between. What does this loop do? Well, basically the same thing, right? You start at 1, end at 99, and you're going to print I, but you go by 2's, right? You go every other value. So before, when I was 1, I became 2 in this loop. But now I will go from 1 to 3, 3 to 5, etc. So this loop here is printing all numbers between 1 and 99. This loop here is printing all odd numbers between 1 and 99, and it won't get to 99, right? Because this is strictly less than. So it will print 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc., all the way up until 99. Okay, let's think about this one. This is saying as long as I is bigger than 1, and I is going to start at 100. And now the way I update is I do I minus minus. So that takes me down by 1, not up. So I'll start by printing 100, and then the value of I will become 99. 99 is bigger than 1, so then I'll print 99, and I'll keep going that way. So I guess I should put at least one of these in here. So I equals 100, I bigger than 1, I plus plus, print I. Okay, so it'll print 100, then print 99, then print 98. Whoa! Oops. Okay. You said I didn't put this in properly, did I? I minus minus, right? Go down. So I'll come back to my mistake here in a second. But notice what happened, right? I is 100, then down to 99, 98, etc., all the way down to 2. The reason I stop at 2 is because it's strictly bigger than, right? Not bigger than or equal to. So I stop at 2. Now, why'd the code freak out when I did plus plus? Okay, with plus plus, the value of I goes from 1 to 101, then from up to 102, 103, etc. So notice you'll never break out of the loop because I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm going up. So the value of I will always be bigger than 1. So what I inadvertently did was I created an infinite loop. This loop will never terminate. It just keeps running forever. And that's bad. You know, we've discussed this before in a previous video. You don't want to create loops that run forever. Okay, so what will this one do? It looks similar to the one a second ago, right? I is 100, I minus minus, print I, but notice the Boolean condition is I less than 100, okay? So what I'm saying is I is 100. As long as I is less than 100, please do this thing for me. Notice though, this condition is not met initially. I starts at 100, and 100 is not less than 100. So this loop will actually do nothing, okay? It will print nothing to the screen. You have to satisfy this Boolean statement initially even to go into the loop. And that's just like a while loop, isn't it? To go inside of a while loop, you must satisfy that Boolean condition on it. So here I've just created emptiness, right? Maybe I meant to type, what, 200 here or something? I don't know, whatever. Okay, one common mistake or one common error when thinking about for loops is miscalculating how many times the loop will run. So let's think about this. We start at 0, and then we go up to and including 10. So this loop will run 11 times, okay? Let's count it out. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, okay? So you might think this loop runs 10 times because you go from 0 to 10, but it's 0 to 10 inclusive, you know. So since you include 0 in there, that's 11 passes. If you went from I equals 1 to 10, that would be 10 passes through the loop. So when you're first getting used to these loops, there are many things that might go wrong. You could run your loop one too many or one too few times. As this example sort of illustrates, I might have thought it ran 10 times, but it actually runs 11 times. You can set up the wrong upper or lower bound for your counter variable. That variable I is called the counter variable. you shouldn't monkey around with the value of I inside your loop, okay? You are changing the value of I right here. So don't mess with it inside the loop. And also, as we saw, creating an infinite loop. So just to re-emphasize point 3 here, consider a loop like this. I is 1 as long as I is less than or equal to 10, and then I'm going to up the value of I by 1, but then inside the loop I down the value of I by 1. Okay? This line of code, no matter what you write here, is considered bad form. You should not change the value of this I variable inside of the loop. Okay, it's very confusing. If you want to update I, you do it right there. Okay. Also, by the way, I've been using I's here. You can use whatever letter you want, you know. So I could put a K right there, right? You can call it whatever. It doesn't matter. So this runs the same way. Whoa, my infinite loop again. Oops. Anyway, the thing to keep in mind, though, is that once this loop is done running, assuming it does run, this K variable is killed. So later in the code, I can be like, hey, int K, you know. And the computer doesn't yell at me for using the same name for two different things because K was destroyed at the end of that loop. So right here in the code, there is no such thing as K. Okay, I want to show you one more example to close this video out, but let me just end before that by talking briefly about when to use what kind of loop. We have 3 loops. Why even have 3? Right? They all do basically the same thing. They all just loop code. Why don't we just have 1? Well, while versus do while we already talked about. Use the do while if you want to guarantee the loop runs at least once. Otherwise, if you don't care if the loop runs at least once, maybe the loop shouldn't be entered at all, you know. You can use a while. So those are basically the same. Well, why would you ever use a for loop? The reason that people use for loops is it gives you a way to run loops a fixed number of times where you know ahead of time how many times you want that loop to run. So in this example here, this minus, this is a loop that will run 100 times. I have explicitly built it to run 100 times. It starts at 100, goes down to 1, right? So with for loops, if you know, hey, this chunk of code I want it to run 30 times, 1,000 times, whatever, it's just more natural to use a for loop. It is set up so that you can just run the same chunk of code a fixed amount of times where you know ahead of time how many times you want that to happen. Now with while loops, you can do the same thing, you know. Anything a for loop does, a while loop could do, but it's just sort of more natural once you get used to it to use for loops for that kind of thing. So let me close with a non-trivial example. We talked about nested loops last time. So let me show you how you can nest for loops in a really nice way to draw out tables like this. Okay, so imagine throwing 2 dice and just recording what you see. What could you possibly see? You could see a 1 on the first die and a 1 on the second die. A 1 on the first die, a 2 on the second die. 1 on the first, 3 on the second, etc. You know, you could see a 3 on the first and a 2 on the second. So what you have here is a table, a 6 by 6 table, where the first coordinate of each ordered pair here represents what the first die is showing you, and the second coordinate represents what the second die is showing you. So how could you print this to the screen? How could you set up a loop to print this to the screen for you? Well, what you could do is, when you're building a table like that, you know, a table has 2 dimensions, right? It has rows and columns. So here's the first row. Here's the second row, right? Here's the third row. What you can imagine doing is just going through the table and building it row by row. So let's create a variable I that keeps track of what row I'm in. So I have row 1 up to and including row 6, and I'm going to go 1 row at a time. Okay. So when I is 1, what I want to do is spell this out. I want it to print row 1. And then when I is 2, I want it to print row 2. And when I is 3, row 3, etc. Once you are inside a given row, right, once you're inside row 2, Well, now you need to march through and print 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, right? So the first number is fixed once you're inside a row. The second number now also goes from 1 to 6, doesn't it? So once you fix 2, now you want to print 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, etc. Well, how could you print the numbers 1 through 6 with a second loop that keeps track of column position? Okay. So what I have here is I have two variables going, I variable and j variable. I keeps track of my row, and then once I'm in a given row, like when I is 1 or I is 2, whatever, then I create a variable j that ranges over the columns from 1 to 6. And what I'll do is I'll print the row I'm in currently, the comma, and then the column I'm in, and then maybe a space. And then once I'm done with a given column, so I've done 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, and I'm ready to move on to the next row. I'm ready to move on to the next row once this inner for loop is done printing. So now I'll print a new line before the value of I kicks up. So let me just print this. And it printed that table for me. Okay. Now, again, this probably looks mysterious to you. For loops, I just introduced them to you, right? Those are mysterious. But a for loop inside of a for loop is even more mysterious. So if you have questions on this, please bring them to class. But let me just briefly walk through what's happening here. I is 1, right? And when I is 1, we enter the for loop here. So what we immediately see is another for loop for j, where j goes from 1 to 6. So I is 1, so I'll print 1, 1. Then the value of j goes up by 1, 1, 2. Then the value of j goes up again, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6. And then this inner for loop is done running once the column number reaches 6. Then I print a new line, I hop back up to the top, the value of I now becomes 2. Okay, well 2 is less than or equal to 6, so in I go. Now I run this inner for loop again, where the columns range from 1 to 6, but now the I value is 2. So that's when I print 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3. By the time j reaches 6, then I'm done with this inner for loop, print a new line, and I'm done. Okay, so after this video, hopefully you are somewhat comfortable with the syntax and use of for loops, especially things like this. I should just be able to give you things like this and ask you, what do these do? Okay, this example at the end is fairly complicated, you know, so please feel free to ask questions at the beginning of class. Otherwise, in the problems in class, we'll see more uses of for loops.